New Philanthropy Capital.
All right, everybody, let's make a start, shall we? A very warm welcome to you all, and thank you for joining this important session in NPC's excellent Everyone's Environment programme. The session today is about who's most affected by the environmental crisis. I think we'd be hard-pressed, wouldn't we, to think of a single person, a single business, a single community, probably anywhere in the world that won't ultimately be affected by the ecological or the climate crisis. But it's fair to say that some groups will be affected much more strongly and much sooner than others. And that's something that the environmental movement is very keen to understand. And the point of the Everyone's Environment programme is to begin to draw out who will be most affected, worst affected by the environmental crisis, to understand with different groups around society how they perceive the environmental crisis affecting them, to draw together evidence of what that means for different groups in society, and then to use that to influence the work of the environment movement in the future, to make sure that we incorporate those concerns into the work that we do, and also to empower different groups across society to play a role in fighting against the ecological and climate crisis, to make sure that everybody can be part of the solutions. So it's tremendously exciting to welcome you today to this important moment in that programme, where we are drawing together the initial research briefings that show some of those effects on different parts of society. We hope that you will have a fantastic and informative session with us today. By way of welcome, it's important to just note for everybody that we are recording the session, that there may be some people of a journalistic persuasion here, eager to write down what you say, so please only share things that you're willing to have on record, but please don't let that stop you being bold and forthright in what you say. Please feel free to be relaxed in the session and to pop in and out as you need to make sure that the session works best for you, because we've got an intense hour and a half together now until 11:30. So how's it going to work? In a moment, we're going to hear from some of the folk who've been leading the work of the programme. Then we're going to split off into some breakout groups to discuss the research findings. And then we'll look to have some further discussion and look forward to the next steps in the programme. First of all, though, I'd like to just take this moment to thank the folks who've been working so hard to deliver the programme, both in NPC and in the partners, and of course to thank the funders who've helped NPC to make the programme work. So there's the William Grant Foundation, Children in Need, the City Bridge Trust, and the Garfield Weston Foundation. So thank you to those guys. Not being sort of directly in NPC or in the programme myself, I've been able to sort of see and appreciate the what you've enabled to happen from afar, and it's been brilliant. But before we turn to the section leads, who will take us through some of the initial research findings on the effects on younger people, older people, people from diverse backgrounds, and people with disabilities, I'd like to turn to Lisa Herning, who is one of the young folk who has taken part in one of the panel discussions that have helped to inform the research. It's been a really brilliant sort of collaborative effort to do this research, working between environmental experts and people in different parts of civil society to begin to bring together knowledge and understand how climate change and nature loss will affect people the most. Lisa was one of the brilliant participants in the Young People's panel. She has a keen interest in environment and activism and how the environmental crisis is affecting young people in particular. We'll turn to her now to hear her responses to the research and her views on how charities and policymakers should respond. So over to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Richard. Right, I'll just get my slides up. Yes, so my name's Lisa. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm a member of Groundwork's Youth Advisory Board. I'm currently an 18-year-old student based in Devon and a member of the so-called younger generation. I've grown up with a sense of duty to the world around me to help protect it, which has given me purpose, hope, and motivation that has extended to my academic studies. Since the age of 13, I've been involved in different environmental movements, from Fridays for Future to Green New Deal Rising to within school and now internationally. I'm one of many more taking this path. However, I, like my peers, also grew up with feelings of anger, distrust, confusion, annoyance, guilt, pain, and an increasingly heavier sense of pressure that only increased as I learned more about the situation, saw a lack of concrete action, and realized my responsibility as a privileged global citizen. Imagination is vital for the situation to change, and therefore young people should be actively included in these conversations. For me, the ideal society would be diverse and inclusive, where young people's voices are not only listened to, but acted upon. Where I would be encouraged to prioritize a career that benefits others or the environment, and where people don't seek to maximize their wealth and profits, where people cycle and use free public transport, and schools focus learning in and around the natural environment, with investments in sports, wildlife, and green spaces, as well as emphasis on social justice through equality. Next slide, please. A lack of investment or exploitation or neglect of the natural environment around us essentially means a lack of investment in our futures. I would also like to emphasize that I'm speaking from a position of immense privilege, and therefore most likely cannot communicate anywhere near the devastating impacts of increased temperature rise. Those that are and will be most impacted are those that hold the least responsibility, particularly those in the global south that will see increased food insecurity, conflicts, diseases, and displacement. However, all of us, even in the UK, will and are already being affected by the climate and ecological emergency. Neglect and exploitation of our natural environment in the UK has caused me to recently become increasingly anxious about spending time in the sea, something that has always been a part of my life and has been vital for my well-being. This was after becoming ill along with some of my friends after spending time in the water. It feels unfair that things that the older generations took for granted in their childhood now seem threatened for us. The MPC report shows the disproportionate impact climate change will have on young people. Something that particularly resonated with me in the report was air pollution effects and young people's vulnerability to this. I remember being horrified back in 2020, when on the day of my 16th birthday, 9-year-old Ella Kissy Deborah's death was ruled to be a result of excessive air pollution. Next slide, please. What I've particularly noticed as a generational difference is the ambition, positivity, and hope a lot of young people have for their futures and our planet. However, increasingly eco-anxiety, or as named in the report, eco-compassion, is a significant issue among young people. And I believe this links closely to government and policymaker inaction, along with feelings of powerlessness as a young person. The report highlights to me quite clearly how much needs to be done to protect young people. But at the moment, it seems like the young people of today will be the ones having to carry the greatest burden. For others like me, a career that is not focused on tackling the climate crisis seems out of the question. We simply cannot afford to give up or not try hard enough like the generations before us. And this responsibility can feel at times like a heavy burden. I don't truly know the impacts of the environmental damage because I wasn't there before. I've never seen kaleidoscopes of butterflies or fields of wildflower meadows that others had told me used to be so common. But I do know that in the UK, in my lifetime, we have lost 97% of our wildflower meadows, 30 million birds, and that insects have decreased by around 60%. And that these shocking figures are only set to worsen. I hope that the children of tomorrow will still get to hear a bird's chorus and see bees buzzing through apple blossom. And I'm hopeful this will be the case due to the strength of individuals and organizations like those here today, trying to break through the inaction and push for change to secure the futures and lives of young people. Next slide, please. I am very positive for a better future. The solutions are there. They just need to be implemented. The report shows the positive impacts these policies could have on young people. like the creation of green jobs, the mental health benefits of green and blue spaces, and the impact of access to affordable public transport on young people's education. Everything is possible. And what's excruciating is that as a student in a secondary school, we already study places where climate solutions are integrated into people's daily lives, like Freiburg in Germany with their passive homes. But the realities of installing a heat pump, solar panels, owning an electric car, or even just getting your walls insulated here in the UK seems unfeasible for the majority of households. Environmentally friendly solutions are also those which often have a positive mental or physical health impact, like rewilding, a switch to a more plant-based diet, or cycling, for example. The children of today, the future leaders of tomorrow, will benefit in multiple ways through environmentally friendly initiatives, as highlighted in this comprehensive report. Two policies highlighted in the report seem most attractive to me currently: affordable public transport and investment in women in STEM. The latter, something which I only came across during the focus group. Women are currently less likely to enter STEM careers, and so therefore would be most likely to lose out on new investments into green jobs. For me, this is something that needs to change if we are to ensure we tackle climate change without increasing gender inequality. Next slide, please. So what can you do? The later young people's voices are included, the greater the burden on us will be when we are eventually given a say. So include us in the internal structures of your organisations as a necessity. It is important not to alienate individuals and young people in society through complicated or inaccessible messaging of campaigns, reports, or policies, something which the MPC report and my time on the focus group has expertly prevented. So increased access to information like these reports will increase young people's access to this kind of information. And the call for affordable public transport, for safer cycling in cities, and for green space that is accessible to all is also generally an intergenerational request that should be prioritised alongside providing the opportunities for aspirational change-making individuals or groups to carry out their ideas for society through the provision of grants for social action. In order for action to be long-lasting and effective, a global view is required to tackle this global problem. We need to see ourselves as citizens of the world and take actions as if we were such. The younger generation is trying to speak up, but with lacking representation in positions of influence and power, our calls for action are falling short of having concrete impacts. So, in your positions of influence and power, play your role to secure the green, healthy, and prosperous futures we all deserve, where birds still sing, insects buzz, and children get to enjoy the beauty of our coastline and rivers that they have to offer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Some people occasionally say to me, Richard, how do you and your green chums not sink in despair on working on these matters day in, day out? And the answer is so often hearing from people like Lisa and Jabir and Dan and Meryl and Graham, who we'll hear from later, who are just utterly inspiring champions. And I think you'll agree that Lisa has set a great standard there. If you've got questions for Lisa, who'll be joining the panel later, please pose those in the chat and questions to other panelists as they come, and we'll be keeping track of those, and there'll be a chance to have a full discussion shortly. But before that, I'm pleased to turn to Liz Gadd, who is Principal Consultant at NPC and has co-led the Everyone's Environment programme, particularly with the charity partners. Liz is going to give us the overview of the research briefing now and to hit us with the headlines before we move into the panel discussion. Liz, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you, Lisa, for such an inspiring start. It was fantastic to have you involved in the programme, as well as to hear your very powerful call to action this morning. So the key question for today is who is most affected by the environmental crises? We can say that much of the social impact of the climate and nature crises is going to be due to multiple injustices and social barriers. as well as linked to existing health issues and exacerbated by location and income level. Those most affected are often those with whom charities and funders work already, and supporting these groups is central to all of our missions. But it's also ethically right that charities and funders work to support a just and fair transition to a post-carbon and ecologically sustainable world, be that at the UK level, across our 4 nations, or at a more local level, including mayoral cities like London. This slide shows the logos of some of the 40 plus funders and charities working together on the Everyone's Environment programme. Together, we're collaborating to accelerate action on the social impacts of the environmental crises. And this is the first year of a 2+ year programme. But together, we're gathering evidence of the impact of the environmental crises as they will be felt by different social groups in the UK. We're speaking directly to those people about their priorities, and we're bringing social and environmental charities together to address barriers to action and find common ground on policy. Today, we're going to be discussing the findings of the first phase of research in the programme, looking at the impacts on 4 different social groups. Firstly, young people in the UK, research that was funded by Children in Need and the William Grant Foundation with our lead partner Groundwork. And then people from ethnic minority communities, disabled people and older people, work that was funded by Citybridge Trust, the William Grant Foundation and Garfield Weston, and done with our lead partners, the Race Equality Foundation, Disability Rights UK and Reengage. I'll highlight some of the findings from the free briefings, but bear in mind, this is only a taster of the richness of information that's available in the briefings. So firstly, how are young people affected? Well, the greatest body of evidence is that the environmental crisis affects young people's physical development, their physical health, and mental health. But we've also found evidence of impacts on their education, development, and income. Children born in 2020 will face twice as many wildfires, nearly 3 times more crop failures, over 2.5 times more droughts, almost 3 times more river floods, and almost 7 times as many heat waves during their lives as those who were born in 1960. This, of course, is negatively affecting their health, welfare, and development. Exposure to heat, air pollution, and toxic chemicals is impacting birth outcomes, physical development, mental and physical health. And our changing climate and its impact on the patterns and prevalence of disease is increasing some diseases, like Lyme disease, and bringing other new ones to our shores. Education is being disrupted by extreme weather. Heat can have a direct impact on lowering academic performance, and schools are not always preparing young people for the green jobs ahead. Those in low-income households are more exposed to air pollution and toxic chemicals than their more affluent peers. They're more likely to live in poorly adapted housing, less likely to have access to green and blue spaces, and less likely in general to bounce back easily after extreme weather events. And young people from ethnic minority groups and disabled young people are disproportionately represented in those low-income households and therefore are particularly affected. These groups have the most to gain from policies and programmes that improve housing, air quality, public transport, green spaces, address those financial barriers to the transition to a post-carbon economy. And as Lisa was saying, women and girls could particularly benefit from improved access to STEM-related education and training that leads to green jobs. How are ethnic minority communities affected? Well, again, we see poor birth outcomes as one impact, and this combines for women from ethnic minority communities with wider health inequalities and often greater exposure to air pollution. The increased risk of physical health issues, particularly related to heat waves and/or air pollution, is rooted in existing health inequalities and profound social inequity. Low-income groups, again, most affected, and more likely to be living in areas of high pollution, subject to flooding, and in poorly adapted housing. 44 of the most deprived local authority areas in England have 4 times more people from ethnic minority communities than other areas. Travellers are particularly exposed. They're 7.5 times more likely to experience housing deprivation, and traveller sites are often in highly polluted areas. Access to green and blue spaces is less amongst ethnic minority communities. And this is due to a combination of poor quality and quantity of spaces near their homes, fewer opportunities and cultural barriers to visiting places like national parks, and a greater likelihood of living in tower blocks in cities. In London, there's a strong correlation between flood risk and diversity of local populations. And despite ongoing improvements, communities with a higher proportion of people from ethnic minority communities are exposed to higher levels of air pollution. The impact of policies on people from these communities is mixed. Some policies, like those targeting fuel poverty, insulation, air pollution, have brought benefits. But this is likely because people from ethnic minority communities are most likely to experience fuel poverty and live in polluted areas in the first place. The evidence suggests that people from ethnic minority communities have been less likely to benefit from policies on electric vehicles and solar panels, but are more likely to want to access green jobs and start cycling. And how are older people and disabled people affected? They are particularly in a position of having housing that isn't adapted sufficiently to not just their needs, but also the needs of living in a changing climate. And we can see a wide range of risks of physical health issues exacerbated, ranging from a greater number of people admitted to hospital for cardiovascular or respiratory issues on high air pollution days, to issues like sun hats not being designed for blind people, so hindering their ability to use echolocation to navigate a space. Existing health conditions can cause people to be more greatly affected. For example, many people with multiple sclerosis experience a worsening of symptoms in hot or humid weather. It's harder to regulate our body temperature as we age, which can lead to heat cramps, heat rash, dizziness and fainting, heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and an increased likelihood of falls. And some medications can reduce the ability to sweat and increase the risk of overheating. Other medications can react negatively in the heat. Risk communication isn't routinely accessible for people who are deaf or have hearing loss, are blind or have low vision, or experience cognitive impairment, including dementia or Alzheimer's. And this can lead people to underestimate their risk level and be poorly prepared. Again, low-income houses are most affected. Excuse me. The impacts of policies on older and disabled peoples is also mixed. Older people benefit from numerous policies to reduce pollution and mitigate climate change, including those on fuel poverty, renewable technologies, and insulation. Older people would benefit from further improvements to active travel and public transport. However, disabled people appear to benefit from fewer policy areas, mainly those related to insulation and fuel poverty, despite their having comparable risks to older people. And there will need to be changes to policies on electric vehicles, active travel, and public transport for disabled people to get greater benefit. Older people and disabled people on low incomes have likely benefited least from policies introduced so far and would require changes to policies on renewables, emergency planning, and electric vehicles. As you can see from our first research briefings, there are some key cross-cutting themes. People in low incomes or living in poverty will be most affected by the direct impacts of the climate and nature crises. People from ethnic minority communities and disabled peoples being proportionately represented within those households. And mental and physical health impacts are significant, but there's also impacts on jobs, education, and more. The benefits of access to green and blue space for our health, well-being, and even young people's academic performance, to name but a few, are not being maximised, especially for groups who are hardest hit by the crises. And lastly, there's insufficient evidence of how policies affect different social groups. Indeed, many environmental policies have little or no mention of people at all, a major gap that government nationally and regionally needs to fill if policies are going to work for all people. As the Everyone's Environment programme, we and our partners are currently engaging with young people, older people, disabled people, and people from ethnic minority communities to gather their views on the research findings and their priorities for next steps. And together we'll be publishing findings this autumn. We're also running roundtables to find some common ground on policy issues between social and environmental charities. And we're raising funds and convening partners for further strands of the programme and exploring together how best to support the sector to embed learning. And to conclude, what's next after today for you, after this webinar? We recommend that you read and share the briefing widely, discussing with your organisations what the findings mean for you and how this will affect the future of your programme strategy and influencing work. If you're a funder and potentially could fund some of our other strands and further work, please contact Leah. And if you're interested in getting involved in the programme, please contact me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Liz. I thought that you presented some really shocking facts there with sort of admirable objectivity of the scientist, but it adds to some of the heartbreak of the nature loss that Lisa was describing, with what frankly ought to be outrage at the social injustice that comes with this inequity. And what better way to explore that than to turn to our panel? So we're going to turn now to the discussion part of the session. We have 5 experts on the panel. Somebody has said in the chat that they're certainly feeling outraged. That's good. The other thing that was really notable in Liz's talk, though, was I think that we must combine outrage with intelligent response in terms of thinking how we respond. It was really notable, wasn't it, that some of the policy reactions to nature and climate loss can actually exacerbate some of the inequality as we go. And so heartbreak combined with intelligent outrage is the way forward, and we can only do that together. Let's turn now to the panel. So please start posing questions to the panel. I'll invite each of the panel members maybe to give a top issue that they were surprised about in the research findings as we go round. So heads up, panel members, just to kick things off. But it'd be fantastic to hear questions from you as we go. So first of all, we've got Leah Davis, who's Head of Policy and External Affairs at NPC. And she has been leading the work on Everyone's Environment programme with Liz and Naomi, particularly in the partner charities and policy work. Leah, do you want to just pop in with a sort of top fact or surprising conclusion that you'd like to share with folk?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think I worked on the briefing with Liz and with all our partners. I think the thing that was surprising that's been hinted at already is that there's lots of evidence out there. We're not finding, this wasn't new evidence that we were creating. It's information that's been out there and available for quite a while. Some of you may well have already been working on it. And I think the surprising thing for me was seeing how much that this really affected certain groups that were already impacted unequally in terms of health inequalities, wealth inequalities, development, educational. And I think the surprising thing is that this is only really coming out now to some extent in terms of why didn't somebody do this work way before we did, I think was a surprising thing. And why isn't there kind of more knowledge and mainstreaming, both in kind of environmental groups and in social groups as well. So in some ways, I think there's lots of reasons, good reasons. There's been a heck of a lot of other priorities at the moment. But that's the one thing that stood out to me. Why hasn't it been done sooner?
Thank you. A good question. Maybe Dan's got the answer, but I'd like to hear Dan's surprising fact too. I'm going to turn now to Dan White, who's Policy and Campaigns Officer at Disability Rights UK, which is a national disabled-led organisation working for better rights for disabled people across the UK. Dan, over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Richard, and good morning, everybody. A bit overwhelmed by the numbers here, but it's fantastic that so many people have come along today to join in this discussion and have a look at the briefing and hopefully take this forward onward from now. It's been a pleasure to be involved. Just for context, I have a hidden disability and I'm a carer to my daughter, Emily, who has a physical disability. But as we were working through this, there were a lot of surprising factors that even within the work I'm doing on climate change and disability, I wasn't aware of, if you know what I mean. There's so much to it and it's so far reaching and reaches so far within the community. But I think the most surprising thing really from an external perspective, not from my perspective, is that when you talk about disability and climate change to other organisations or to the political spectre or even to the media spectre, they're still entrapped by stereotypes of what actually disability is. They're still entrapped by those decade-old stereotypes, so they're not fully aware of the beauty and the breadth of the disabled community, of the wonderful faith, of the wonderful colour, of the wonderful age and diversity within it. That to me has been the biggest shocking factor. They've been focusing. The stereotypical image, excuse me for saying so, is always of a white person in a wheelchair. As we know, that's far from the truth. So what I'm hoping with this report is, as it kicks off, is it can literally help smash those stereotypes, because when stereotypes are smashed, you find engagement is easier and understanding is easier. People are more likely to come on board if they have that knowledge, if you see. It's a wonderful thing my old man used to say when he was alive, was that words win wars at the end of the day. And I'm hoping off the back of this report that will actually do this. So stereotypes will go and more engagement will follow, because I think that's the only real way we're going to solve this issue from a perspective, and no doubt within many other perspectives and groups we have here.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan. And another group that's often unfairly homogenized is the older demographic, and Meryl led the with you, Dan, the group on older people and people with disabilities. Meryl's chief executive of Re-engage, a charity reducing loneliness among older people. Meryl, over to you.
Thanks very much, Richard. Yes, it's been really interesting to look at the ways in which we have so much in common. And I suppose one of the things that is incredibly important for me, and on the back of Lisa's comments as well. Lisa, I think you'll feel the same way you do now when you're 75 and 85 and 95. And there are lots of people who used to be you and were unheard, just like you feel unheard. And what's really frustrating is that older people continue to feel as if their voices don't count, and yet there's this wealth of knowledge. And actually there are lots of older people who care deeply about issues to do with the environment, and a large number of older people who feel that this is one thing that they really want to do something about at this stage in their lives. So one of the important things just to remember is that when you have excess deaths, that lovely phrase that we've all learnt to find so familiar, that's amongst older people, that when there's a heat wave or a flood, then there's a disproportionate number of people who lose their lives are people who are older. And so there's an awful lot for us all to do for the young people that we are or have been, and for the older people that we are or will be. And finding those ways of working together has been really powerful part of this Everyone's Environment project to date, and will continue as we go forward.
Thanks, Meryl. It's one of those awful euphemisms, isn't it? Excess deaths for utter failure of action leads people to die sooner. It's as simple as that. Let us turn now, if we may, to Graham. So Graham leads the strand of the Everyone's Environment programme, looking at the impacts on young people. He's chief executive by day of Groundwork UK and has been with Groundwork, I learned from my notes here, for 25 years. That's a good score, Graham. Over to you.
25 not out. we're on cricket scores already. Thanks, Richard. So it's been brilliant to be part of this program. Groundwork, if you don't know what we do, has been kind of working with young people for 40 years to help them understand and take action on environmental issues, quite often environmental issues on their doorstep in their neighbourhood. So I'm going to avoid the word surprised in my turn here, because I'm not actually very surprised by lots of the stuff that's been found in the briefings, because I think as Liz and Leah both commented, a lot of this evidence has been around for a long time. So it's what's good is that it's looked at through different lenses and kind of brought into sharper focus here, and then being turned into some positive concrete steps that social sector organisations and funders can take. I think that the two things that probably stood out to me most when you look across all of the briefings. One is the reliance on our infrastructure. And in particular, this is felt by young people, especially young people from low-income backgrounds, just a sheer reliance on being able to get around on public transport, being able to kind of be outside and have leisure time in public parks, being able to paddle in the sea. You'd have thought that was just a very straightforward kind of low-cost option for young people that have got that potential, and that's being taken away from them at the moment. And I think the issue for me is the fact that a lot of that infrastructure in communities and infrastructure in society is threatened and frayed and crumbling in certain cases. I'm not going to open up a whole debate about the water sector, but you can see that kind of stuff going on, and that really means that this kind of linkage between health inequalities and environmental justice and environmental inequalities really comes to the fore and becomes a sort of defining issue of the age. They're two sides of the same coin, whether it's poor quality housing or air pollution or sanitation or whatever it is. Those two things are inextricably linked. And I'm reminded that great public health reformers and campaigns started in the Victorian era precisely because of the environmental inequalities that came about through urbanization and industrialization, and that's where that kind of sense of injustice and that sense of campaigning and that sense of improving the health of the population came from. And it feels like we're getting back to another age where that connection needs to be right at the forefront. We need that campaigning zeal about connecting kind of inequality and health with environmental justice, environmental, reduction of environmental harms and more equitable access to environmental benefits. So I think this conversation is part of that reconnection and establishing that bridgehead for the next round of kind of campaigning activity on this front.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Thanks, Graham. Let's turn now to the next member of our panel, Jabir Butts, Chief Executive of the Race Equality Foundation, which is, for those of you who haven't seen its brilliant work, a national charity tackling racial inequality in public services and policy. And Jabir has been leading the EEP programme on ethnic minority communities.
Thank you, Richard. I think the starting point for me is perhaps not surprise, but made me think again, or made me think better about some of the issues. We constantly talk about managing heat and managing cold and the impact it has on minority communities. But in one of our earlier sessions, somebody pointed out, just imagine trying to do that in a caravan or in a mobile home. And in many ways, for the Gypsy Roman traveller community, that challenge of climate change is an urgent one, and one that's impacting them today. And perhaps what our briefing does is makes people think again about some of those issues, and hopefully they think about better solutions as well. But I think the key thing for me, and one that I hope we'll all reflect on, is that while we often talk about who's the most impacted, almost always there's also a conversation as to who's most to blame as well for climate change. And unfortunately in this country, we have got into a racist conversation about the country being full. And as a result of the country being full, we cannot perhaps meet some of our commitments in terms of migrants and other communities. And that has a very real impact on the daily lives of minority ethnic people, when we start thinking about environmental change, because people do point the finger and say it's because you've all arrived in this country that these things have become worse. And we just need to make sure that in the discourse we develop and in the solutions that we think about, that we don't replicate that, but actually start thinking about how those communities have actually had a transformative impact on Britain, and actually recognize the value that these communities bring and how we need to better protect them.
Thank you, Jabir. It's clearly a conversation that needs flipping on its head, isn't it? As the very real prospect of climate refugees and water wars and increasing conflicts over scarce resources is going to mean more people fleeing for their lives because of ecological risks. So thank you. And the final member of our panel, I have a feeling that these words will be said more often in the future. The final member of our panel needs no introduction because it's Lisa Herning, who you heard from earlier, and she's very pleased that she's joining the panel too. The NPC team have been kindly curating your questions in the background as you posed them in the chat. Please throw some more in. We've got about 10 minutes for questions now. The first is a very good question about how we can persuade funders to appreciate the exponential intersectional impacts of climate and nature loss and use their resources to help tackle the issue. This is one of the practicalities of action. Anybody got any thoughts about that in the panel, please? How can funders build this into their work, particularly when thinking about reaching out beyond the environmental sector? Leah looked like she was leaning forward.
I was going to say, because I think maybe we're not the best people to answer it, if I'm honest. I think a funder's the best person to answer it, and we for everyone's environment, if the funders we have are predominantly maybe seen as more social ones in some ways. They don't have necessarily, not all of them are traditionally funded environmental work. And they have all moved into this because they want to understand more about it and they want to understand what their impact can be. So I think, and they can speak for themselves, I'm sure they're in the chat as well, but I think they're great examples of people who are moving into thinking about, well, actually this environmental stuff is going to impact the people that, the charities that we support, the people that they serve. So I think part of the work we're doing in this programme is to try and show that to funders, to help them kind of make those links, because, like I said, I don't think it's been obvious and easy, and there's been evidence, it's been really dispersed. So I hope that some of the work we're doing here will help to do that.
Thanks, Leah. Just scanning for whether others want to come in there, perhaps.
Richard, can I just come in there? I probably agree with Leah that I don't see any kind of big barriers to funders making these connections. I think there's quite a lot of kind of social funders now wanting you to demonstrate as an organisation applying for their funds that you're taking the environmental issues seriously in what you're doing, and likewise there are environmental funders that want you to demonstrate that your work is impacting those that need it most from a kind of social perspective. So I think that battle is beginning to be won. I think that one of the challenges is how we as voluntary sector organisations join up our capabilities and join up our expertise in responding to some of those opportunities, as opposed to kind of assuming, as you quite often do when you're bidding for grant funds and so on and so forth, that you can find the answers to everything somehow within your armoury, within your delivery. Actually, kind of reaching out, recognising that you need to work alongside others to find that expertise about how to mould environmental messaging so that it meets the needs of a certain demographic that you might not traditionally reach. I think those are the kind of bits of connectivity that hopefully, again, this kind of discourse will open up.
Brilliant. Thanks, Graham. And there's a good question popped up to say, if you had your dream result from the Everyone's Environment programme, would it be that more social charities campaign for the environment, or that more environmental charities incorporate social concerns in their campaigning better? Any any thoughts on that one, please? And maybe the answer is both, but I'd be interested to hear your views.
I think the answer is definitely both. It'd be a wonderful epiphany moment if both things happened at once. Obviously, because this is something that is affecting everyone, and obviously, this is something that is growing in notoriety, whether it be through media or through charities. From the work I'm doing, funny enough, on disability and climate change, when I mention it to another fellow disabled person's organisations or a fellow charity, whether they be big or small, their ears suddenly prick up and they suddenly say, "Oh, we hadn't thought of that. Or can you tell us some more about that?" So once you sort of once I've been dropped that in the conversation when it comes to these other charities and organisations, then the conversation starts throwing off, and then of course then the relationship builds upon that, and then we grow bigger voices and stuff. But I think the biggest issue with the disabled community is when it comes to engaging is we have to get rid of this narrative of the term of what is called eco-ableism. I don't know if people are aware of the word eco-ableism, which is when non-disabled environmental activists and governments fail to recognise the barriers that we face as disabled people, and then we're not involved in the conversations and the solutions and stuff like that. So I think externally that's something that we have to really work hard at in the first place to get rid of.
Thanks, Dan. And Lisa, young people seem to have come forward to sort of champion climate change and ecology as prominent issues for a generation. How do you think that can be fed through to link up with some of the big charities? We sometimes see there's a disconnect, don't we, between some of those sort of bottom-up movements and some of the big institutions. Is there a solution to that one?
Well, I think even just from my own experience, I kind of, at the age of 13, like, I guess, started from more, grassroots, like on the streets campaigning. I firsthand saw the barriers to different groups, whether that was ethnic minorities or disabled individuals that actually physically didn't feel they were safe to go out on the streets like so many of us were able to. And I think lots of those issues we could have been better supported with as youth organisations, with not the experience or the understanding of, for example, media and police liaison. But then for me, then I kind of took a step back after COVID, and then got more internally involved within organisations. So the fact that there was the opportunity for me to transfer my skills from kind of grassroots organising into organisations that accepted kind of my activist approach to environmental campaigning and things like that, that was really welcoming, and more organisations that can kind of open up to those individuals and young change makers that want to see a change in the world, and maybe they're involved in, extreme theatricals and things like that, but that's the way they want to express their anger and then take that on board as energy into their organization. I think that's really, really positive and needs to be replicated with lots of organizations. But also kind of leading on from the first point mentioned on the panel, I think the environmental movement offers such an opportunity for intergenerational, inclusive, uniting kind of a movement. I think that in such a kind of in an increasingly divided world, it actually offers an opportunity to be to bring people together, whether that's disabled individuals in the LGBTQI plus community. I think it's a very inclusive community. Maybe before in the past it was less so, maybe it was more alienating, but I think I've seen it and I know that there's a lot of power in that, and I think that it offers the environmental movement, and embracing the environmental movement actually offers a lot of solutions to other social inequality issues in society as well. So, and also speaking from personal experience, my whole environmental activist kind of career as such so far has been entirely encouraged and supported by people from the older generation, and I wouldn't have learned as much as I had. I wouldn't have been mentored by so many amazing individuals with their amazing knowledge if it wasn't for that support from the generation. So I think there's a great opportunity for intergenerational work there. And organizations need to really embrace that, I think, because it's a great positive change.
Thanks, Lisa. And that issue that you raised there about multiple benefits brings us really to Jabir and Meryl, and I can see Jabir wants to come in anyway, so I'll turn to you first. But one of the other questions in the chat is about how the impacts of the crises play out through different systems, so infrastructure and healthcare, closed schools and social isolation. Jabir and Meryl, it would be good to hear from you how you think that in creating that kind of new movement around social equity that Graham was talking about, how you combine those multiple issues of infrastructure and all those challenges with environment in the work you do. Jabir first, then Meryl.
Thank you, Richard. Richard, unfortunately, I'm of that age where I spend lots of time shouting at the radio or at the TV, because it's almost always the case that when we start talking about environmental impact, the questioner or the respondent will start talking about individual behaviours that could change, recycle your plastic, don't drive and things like that. Whereas the reality is that we need systemic change, we need structural change. For example, we've been extremely poor at insulating our homes, and that has had a detrimental impact on minority communities, because they tend to live in the poorest quality homes and therefore need the greatest investment to bring those homes up to a standard that can be, but that's not being done, even though we know what the solution is, even though to an extent we know what the cost is, because we keep focusing on individual behaviours rather than those structural behaviours. So I think if there is something to be achieved here, is to actually get people to focus on the things that really need to be changed. Having said that, I think we also need to develop a language that doesn't pit different groups against each other, that we don't see disabled people here or young people there or women there or ethnic minorities there, and starts talking about the most extreme or the greatest risk and so on. Because the reality is that a proper investigation would identify there are risks being faced by different groups, but it's the failure to have that lens, the race equality lens or the disability lens, that often means we come up with solutions that may work for some, but don't work for everyone that they should. And it's developing that intersectional, to use that terrible phrase, that intersectional approach that will actually ensure that we come up with solutions that apply to everyone and hopefully benefit everyone.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jabir. So it's back to that point about intersectional strength, but also intersectional awareness in the things that you're praising together. Meryl, does that work for you too?
It certainly does, yes. And I think, helpfully, there are an awful lot of older people, and therefore a lot of people to involve, a bit like young people. I thought I'm really pleased that we've come to Janet's question, because I think it's really interesting to think about the impact sort of around the edges of things. And the thing that came to my mind here was around social prescribing. And social prescribing is hugely important to the work that we do. And we work with older people over the age of 75 who are experiencing loneliness and social isolation. And social prescribers send them to us. Then at the moment, there's an awful lot in the media about social prescribing of green spaces and taking a walk in the woods and that sort of thing. And yet access to green spaces is just being taken, as Lisa was talking about. We don't have access to green spaces, and a lot of older people and a lot of people with disabilities and a lot of people living in poor housing and so on just don't have access to green spaces. So yes, there are all of those interesting things around the edges that we absolutely have to bear in mind, because actually that's where this is going to fail. The idea of social prescribing is going to fail if you prescribe something that doesn't exist or it's difficult to have access to. And so that's just one example, but I think it's, it reminds us of all of the sort of side issues around a lot of solutions, and that why coming together like this is so important to think about. I think the other thing is it's important for us. I want to come for a moment back to that other question of what's more important. And I think that one thing that has surprised me by getting involved in this project has been the learning about how little mention there is of people in environmental research and so on. And that's something that Liz and Leah have absolutely sort of opened my eyes to. Working on this project has opened my eyes to. So I think that I'm going to, stick my neck out and say I would like to see the recognition of people in environmental work and environmental activism and so on. Because actually, I think that in the end, policymakers are going to make decisions about people, sadly, more than they are about trees. And so therefore, perhaps, we really do have to say this is affecting people, it's affecting people now, and it's affecting all people.
Thanks, Meryl. A brilliant call to action, and the credibility for doing that relies on working together, doesn't it? And I think that's where the briefings here really help us, and hopefully trying to solve that question that Graham raised about how we create a genuinely shared movement will help us to make sure that green campaigns incorporate people with the credibility of working in partnership with groups that represent those people. So folks, that brings us to the end of our time as a panel. We're going to turn now to a polling question, if we may. So in a moment, a question will pop up in front of you, and I think Amina and Isabella might just pop up as well to explain what's going on here.
Hi, everyone. So you may have already seen the pop-up of the poll, and we just really like to know from you where you're at regarding the topics that have been discussed so far. So the first question is around whether this event or reading the various briefing papers have helped you to get a better understanding of the social impact of the climate and nature crises on the people you and your organization, if relevant, works to support. And then we'd also really like to know if you or the organizations that you represent, to what extent you're aware of how to embed your response to the social impacts of the climate and nature crises in your programs or your strategies and influencing. And then lastly, we have a question around to what extent you and or the organization you represent are already trying to respond to the social impacts of these crises in your work. So thanks everyone for answering those in advance, and we really look forward to seeing the responses.
Great, thanks Isabella. And once you've done the polling, in a moment we're going to head for the part of the session where we put you to work and head into breakout groups. So really pleased that Dan and Meryl will be leading the group for folk with disabilities and older demographic. Graham will be leading the group on young people, and Jabir will be leading the group on ethnic minorities. So you will be cast into those groups in a moment, and you'll have an option to choose which you would like the most. If you have any trouble joining a group, please flag it in the chat, and NPC team will help. We'll have 30 minutes together for these discussions. Hello, welcome back everybody. Thank you so much for your contributions in the groups. That brings us pretty much to the end of our session today. So thank you again to everybody who's joined us. There will be lots more opportunities to take part. The next element of the programme is in the autumn. We are turning to promote the findings from the deliberation groups with the communities that are affected by the nature and climate crisis. And this is where you get the chance to hear from those groups about how they want us to respond to these important findings. So please do watch out for updates and come along. In the meantime, please get the briefings out there into the world. I think the message from today is just how much we can do to build that understanding of how much social injustice and the nature and climate crises are intertwined, and how much serious legwork there is to do to build the sorts of institutional links to allow us to respond together in a way that helps to solve those environmental crises without exacerbating and indeed in a way that improves our social equity. And please do get in touch with NPC if you want to be involved more. You can find out how to do that on the NPC website, or you can contact any one of the excellent team who've been with us today. You can see Liz's address in the chat there. It's one of those frontiers, isn't it, that we always say to ourselves, if only we had better links outside our own organizations, then we could find some powerful changes that could help to make those system changes that Jabir was talking about earlier. I think today we have started to build that evidence base that can help us to forge those links. The next steps is to find those common platforms for what we're going to demand together to find those common solutions. It would be amazing if you could take part. Thank you again to the funders. Thank you to NPC for the great idea, and look forward to seeing you again very soon to take this work forward. Thanks so much, and bye for now.